It is just us two that you're going to be looking at. However, there is actually someone else joining us at the moment. His name is Yash, and he's in the back end, and he's in India. I'm in the Dominican Republic. Dr. Rod is in Australia. Yash is in in India, and Yash is my video editor, production guru. He's the one that makes us look good. So he's controlling everything, clicking all the buttons and making us as good. So we might just mention or speak to him every now and then. But please bear with us. This is our first time actually going live with this, but we're excited to be able to share. We've been doing this now for a number of months actually now, and it's been really good. We've had some really good conversations about things that are happening in our everyday news so that we can learn to become better leaders. I keep saying we don't have themes for our episodes, but I always seem to give the episodes a theme. And today's theme is a statement that I was actually shared, I was kind of given. I stole it. Let's just say I borrowed it. And let's say I borrowed it from a guy I used to do a lot of business with. We used to run charity events and stuff like that when I used to live in Sydney in Australia. And he had this amazing saying that he said, control the controllables. Because, in business and in life, in ministry and work, everywhere, there's always things that go wrong. And so how do we as leaders respond to those things? I thought there was a lot of wisdom in his comment of control the controllables. Like just control what you can control and don't worry about what you can't control. And I think that that's a good theme for today as we look at a number of these different events that have happened from across the world to learn how we can be better leaders. We're going to be looking at it from the perspective of, well, how do we control ourselves as a leader when we are in these situations that seemingly we can't control? And so let's talk about probably I would say one of the most uncontrollable situations that a gentleman, once again, I use that term loosely, gentleman, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Andrew Tate, controversial figure. We actually spoke about Andrew Tate months ago. I had a quick look back. I think it was episode 7 or 6 that we actually spoke about Andrew Tate. And Andrew Tate is actually he rose to stardom. He was a bit of a self-help guru, championing kind of masculinity, and he's been controversial because it's been leading into toxic masculinity, and or argued that it is. Now, since our last filming where we spoke about him being controversial, he's since been arrested. And he's been all over the news over the last number of months where he's actually been kept in jail, in a Romanian jail, under charges which he's not actually technically charged yet. He's just been arrested, and they say they're detaining him for safety, for public safety, they say. And there's a lot of arguments both ways whether this is actually whether it's actually a real charges, whether he's actually done it, or whether it's the matrix that are against him and stuff like that. And, there's this law in Romania that says they can detain him for up to 180 days. Now, it's 30 days at a time. Every 30 days, they have to reapply to keep him and his brother, Tristan Tate, detained. And just yesterday for me here, probably 2 days ago for you there in Australia, if you're watching from that side of the planet, he lost his appeal to try to get out because they claim he's a flight risk and everything like that. Now, controversial figure, yes, but I don't really want to talk about that. I don't really want to talk about the charges against him because it's all hearsay. No one knows yet. There's no evidence being given yet. But talking about control the controllables, he is someone that is in a foreign country being arrested by their legal system or judiciary system, and is in detention in a different country and being detained, which is really uncontrollable. And so we in business, in life, find ourselves sometimes in situations that we can't control. Sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we think we could do better or change or something like that, but we do find ourselves in situations where we just cannot control our situation, so we need to control what we control. So, Dr. Rod, how would you give someone advice let's obviously talk about Andrew Tate, someone who is a very positive person. He's let's say he's a personal development guru. He's this, he looks positively on life, and he's that sort of thing. He has affluent life, all that sort of stuff. He's had all that taken away from him. He's in a foreign country, locked up, kind of seemingly unfair. What advice would you give to him in that state for him to maintain his composure as a leader?
Well, I think, you said at the outset, Craig, that you've got to control the controllables, and you can't allow yourself to worry too much about those things that are actually outside your control. I mean, obviously, he has tried through legal means to gain his freedom, but at this point, of course, he's confirmed to remain in custody until the 29th of March. So although he's done his best to get out, he hasn't been able to get out at this point. And look, his case is not all that uncommon, of course, where business people, for example, are operating in a foreign country. They don't necessarily understand the local legal system fully, and they can fall foul of that system. As I recall, there's a bit of an irony here, because one of his reasons for moving to Romania and buying a home there was that he thought he'd actually have more freedom to do the kinds of things that he does.
Yeah.
But it seems as if his expectations haven't been met. And of course, that's something that we have to confront as well as leaders or as people involved in business.
Yeah, I like that, because he went there because he kind of wanted to, let's say, skirt the system, so to speak, and operate slightly outside the realms. And so he wanted to escape something, but then there's always a risk. There's always challenges at that side. I suppose I kind of find, I find myself in the same situation. But let me clarify. I'm nowhere doing anything illegal or anything immoral or anything like that, like he's been accused of doing. What I'm saying is, in the middle of COVID, my wife and I, we just had a baby, weren't even able to see our family in Australia, and everything. We were just so restricted. And so we decided to move to the Dominican Republic. We felt that God also called us to move here for other reasons as well. But that aside, we moved here to the Dominican Republic to a different country, to avoid, to kind of get out of some of the challenges they're facing, simple things like the rent increases and the control of the government and everything like that. And yeah, I came here, and while I was, let's say, escaping those things, I also then stepped into other challenges that I face, the language barrier, the cultural, differences.
With potential outcomes. Now, I have no idea whether that was part of the process either he or you, frankly, went through prior to making that decision. And it's not always easy to make an assessment of risks, because most of the time risk is interpreted as a kind of probabilistic thing, and you can only base a probability on repeated experiments. And when you're making a decision to move country, or maybe to change the job you're in or something like that, you really don't have a history of those kinds of moves, so to form a really good probability. So a lot of it has to be, if you like, a gut feeling. But I do think that we must be wise enough to understand that most of the choices that we make as leaders or as business people have some degree of risk attached to them.
Yeah.
And look, I think it's also very helpful to be able to tap into advisors. So in Andrew Tate's case, obviously, he's tapped into legal advisors in an effort to get out of jail, so to speak. For you, it's been a little bit more difficult, but as many people will know, you do actually have a board of directors, and you're in constant touch with people like myself for advice and support, and of course for prayer. And I think that's also pretty important.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I could draw from this situation, it made me think about what would I do in his situation. And at risk of becoming too spiritual about it, I would say what he can control right now is his mental health, right? We can only control how we react and respond to something. He's at the whims of everyone else. He's in a jail cell. He's being moved around. He's in and out of court, appeals, all that sort of stuff. He's not in control of all those things, but he can control his mental health. And one of the things that I thought of when I was kind of considering what would I do in this situation is I'll just make sure that I was super close with God, because that's the one thing you can do during this time. It's almost a forced prayer and fasting season or whatever, like he's forced to be in a jail cell. So look at what is the advantages of that. Great. He's got solitude. He can just sit in prayer and spend time with the Lord and just get connected that way. I kind of feel that's what I'll do. And as you know, I actually did that last week. I actually traveled away. I found that people think things were just getting a little bit too much, and I wasn't reacting right, everything like that. So I went away for a couple of days to the mountains, house by myself, and just went and reconnected with God, because that's what I could control. I could get centered myself. I could make sure that I was centered, because there's all these things happening around me that I can't control, but I can control myself, my mental capacity. And I knew I was kind of like, let's say, burning the candle at both ends. And so I got away and spent some time with the Lord, and got into the Bible, got into prayer, and had an amazing couple of days out in the mountains. And that's probably one thing that I could say to Andrew Tate and to anyone else that seems like they are, let's say you're in it, you feel like you're trapped in a prison cell. Maybe and that's probably one thing that I could prison cell, but there are times in leadership, in ministry, in business, in life with our families, sometimes we can just feel like we're trapped. Let's just make sure we stay centered, because we as the leaders, everyone else around us is relying on us. They're relying on our strength. They're relying on our stability as a leader. And so we need to control ourselves, and we can only do that by being centered with Christ. And but yeah, as Dr. Rod said, surround yourself with advisors, get connected with God, and that's how you can control the controllables when you feel like you are being trapped, you're in a situation that you are confined to.
Exactly. Look, the only thing I would add to that, Craig, is that I am always in control of how I react to anything that's happening in my environment. But you've got to know that, you've got to have decided that, and you have to have practiced that long before you're in a situation where it becomes imperative.
That's really good. Yeah. It's probably, it is a very commonly used, it's very cliched, is the only thing you control is yourself, or the only thing you can control is your reactions. It's cliche because it's true. So many people say it because it's true. If we get, and that's like, with our leadership program, shameless plug, link in the description, in our free leadership development program, we spend the first 10 weeks focusing on getting to discover who we are and how God has created us and what purpose He's created us for. And then the next 10 weeks on our mindset. So we spend the first 20 weeks of a year-long program just working on ourselves, because we are the ones that can control us. And we actually have a whole teaching on having the right headspace and being prepared mentally for leadership as well. So that's a bit of a shameless plug there. So talking about how we react to things, transitioning to our next topic, in leading into this, I must admit, I was kind of hesitant speaking about this topic, Dr. Rod. Shared it with you and got your advice as we spoke about. We get advice and we said, yeah, let's talk about this, because it is a very touchy subject, and I don't want to get on my soapbox about it, but I also don't want to skirt the actual conversation. This is something that's a little bit closer to Dr. Rod, a little bit closer to home, is the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras that was on this weekend in Australia. And the news is blowing up about a couple of key things. One of those is the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, was the first ever sitting Prime Minister to actually attend and walk in the parade in support of this parade. Now, I actually feel like, from a talking about political leadership, this is obviously the gay and lesbian, or the LGBT, whatever pluses and minuses and divides and everything else that they want to add on. It's a very hot political topic. But I do kind of want to touch it kind of almost from a ministry standpoint, I suppose, especially having someone like yourself, Dr. Rod, as a pastor. How do we, when you see something like this, the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras they talk about it being celebrating diversity, but if you look at it, it's just literally celebrating vulgarity. It's people jumping around half naked in bondage gear, it's just half nude and all that sort of, it's very over sexualized. And I don't know how do we as ministry leaders respond to something like this? Because yes, Jesus has called us to love everyone, and we love the person, we hate the sin, like that sort of thing. Like I've actually been in business with a number of homosexuals and had friends with them. Like I've never agreed with their lifestyle, but I love them as people. And it's always been a very difficult thing of how much do we challenge it versus supporting the people, trying not to alienate, but still influence. Like how would you, let's first talk from a ministerial point of view and talk to, ministry leaders out there. How do we respond to events like this?
Well, it's difficult. Let me say that. There's no doubt about it. It really is difficult. But as a matter of fact, I actually preached 2 or 3 sermons on this very topic a few months ago now. And I titled that series, How to Pray Against the Great Awakening, which was a reference to this kind of thing. And I do recall I really enjoyed reading some of the imprecatory psalms. They're called imprecatory psalms because they're calling on God to do nasty things to our enemies. But I also pointed out that actually that's not the New Testament way. And there are various ways in which we can pray against this kind of thing. And my personal belief is that the most important and powerful thing that we can do is to pray for righteousness to, again, take hold of our nation, to take hold of our political leaders, our business leaders, and even some of our church leaders, because we see some woke ideas infiltrating the church as well. So, look, our primary response, I think, has to be to get on our knees and pray.
Mm-hmm.
However, I would also say this, as citizens, in my case, of Australia, those of us who are Christians have the same right as everybody else to have a voice in the public square.
Mm.
And one of the most worrying aspects of all this is not so much the flaunting and the going against biblical principles for sure, but it's the fact that this is part of a long process now of actually shutting down any voices of dissent. And it's not just Christians. There are other religious traditions as well that uphold the importance of the traditional family as the cornerstone, the building block of societies. So it's not just Christians. And then, of course, there are many who are conservative, but not necessarily Christian as well. So everybody who holds a dissenting view is being closed down in the public square. I think that is a terrible thing. And I just hope that even people like me find the courage in Christ to be able to take their place in the public square as opportunities become available. This is one such opportunity. And I think it would be wrong for me to shrink back and say, look, that's all okay. On the other hand, we do also need to recognise, of course, that by and large, the prophets, as recorded in the Old Testament, and Jesus, and then the writers of the epistles like Paul and so on, they primarily addressed issues that were going on within the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's something else we need to keep in mind as well, that we do need to be fairly careful that we don't undermine the great commandments to love God, to love our neighbour, that is, other people, as we love ourselves, and that we don't also undermine the Great Commission. Go into all the world, and that doesn't just mean countries, that means groups, people holding different worldviews and so on, and make disciples of them. I think there's a real tension there. On the one hand, I find it grossly offensive because I am a classical Christian. I hold to historical Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So I find things like that personally, they're offensive. I would like to get angry like the psalmists and pray some of those imprecatory prayers, but I really don't think we're called to do that as Christians. We're definitely called to pray against the behaviours, not against the people. We're to pray for their salvation. We're to pray for high standards of righteousness among our leaders. And if we're leaders ourselves, let's model high standards of righteousness in every area of our lives.
Yeah. This actually makes me think about trying to think about where I heard this from, but it was one of my mentors shared this with me when I was kind of talking about a topic similar to this with them. And they actually shared with me, like, just remember, people have different values. People have different standards. What they are doing against their own standards is not wrong to them. And so we can't force our standards on just because we see it as wrong in our beliefs. It doesn't mean, how do I say this without trying not to say this without permitting it, but just because we hold ourselves to a certain standard doesn't mean other people have to hold themselves to our standard. We can't judge other people by our own standards. We can only judge ourselves by our own standards. Now, in our beliefs as you said, contemporary Christians, we believe those things are wrong. They don't. In their beliefs, they don't. That's okay. That's their beliefs. Just like we don't want them to force their beliefs onto us, we're not going to force our beliefs onto them. So we can't look at them condemningly because they're not doing something for themselves that they consider wrong, if that makes sense, right? But like you said, we can pray for them that they get a revelation around it, but you can't get upset with someone for doing something wrong that they don't believe they're doing wrong.
Well, there are limits to that, though, because if they thought it was okay to murder somebody, I'm sure that we'd have plenty to say about that, and we would expect the law to uphold certain standards. So I think you've got to be very careful that you don't take that argument too far. But I do think you've made a very good point, and that is that we can't expect them to actually understand where we're coming from, nor can we expect them to act. This is what's happening as conservative voices all over the West are being cancelled or shut down or being denied an opportunity. Look, we see it in politics. There's furor going on in Scotland at the moment over leadership of the Scottish Nationalist Party, because one of the candidates is someone who holds to classical or historical, that is biblical Christianity, and who believes and has stated clearly that she supports traditional marriage, that is marriage as being between a man and a woman by sex, a man who is sexually a man, a woman who is sexually a woman, to the exclusion of all others and for life. And she's being pilloried even by those in her own parties. And it looks increasingly that she won't get a look in at becoming the leader, despite the fact that she's articulate, she's young, she's energetic. She could obviously do a lot of very good things for Scotland, but because she holds a traditional view of marriage and family, she's being shut down. There's a similar example here in Australia of a newly elected member of the Victorian State Parliament who voiced somewhat similar views in her maiden speech. And she's been virtually, she's been pilloried not only by the premier there in that state, but also by her own party, which is supposedly a conservative party, but clearly isn't. So it's pretty tough. Pretty tough.
Look, I want to go back to that murder statement that you just said. Look, obviously I wouldn't take it that far, and you can't, because what I was saying is within their standards, if they're living within a community that sees that murder is wrong, that should be part of their standards, So we obviously there's legal binding thing, but I'm just talking more on the moral grounds. We can't expect someone to live to moral values that they don't believe in, which kind of leads us into not the next topic, but kind of like the next point in this thing is, which I actually, when I first saw it, I thought it was something else. Because you're talking about we need to have a voice, right? Yes, they are doing their bit to try to silence us and to force us down. But we can't, we've got to find as leaders, and this is the thing, as leaders in ministry, as leaders in the marketplace, in businesses, in our families, in society, we actually need to stand up. We need to stand up for our values. Now, it doesn't mean we go against, we just need to stand up for, like Dr. Rod said earlier, we need to have the voice in the local town, in town square, right? We can't be silenced. We need to stand up. Lydia Thorpe, a rogue, now independent, was Green member of Parliament. When I first saw this, she laid down in front of one of the Mardi Gras floats to try to stop the Mardi Gras parade. And at first I thought, the reason why I kind of originally tagged this as something for us to discuss was because I thought she was protesting the Mardi Gras, but she was actually a participant and is actually a supporter of the gay and lesbian she said dark-skinned people, and like for using her terminology, going back back years of their discrimination and everything like that. And I mean, I don't even know what she was doing, but I suppose the what originally brought my attention to it is like, oh, she's protesting the Mardi Gras. When you talk about having that voice in the town square and making sure we stand up for ourselves and make sure we don't get taken over, that's not the right way to do it, is it? To go and lay down in front, like should we be going and kind of attacking their things that they do, or like how should we as leaders stand up for our rights?
Well, I don't know that I'd use her as a good example of how to advance your particular point of view. But look, she does have, in my opinion, a right to her view. And she left the Greens Party because she says she didn't feel free to fight for those things that she really wants to fight for. And she's got a particular agenda in terms of the degree of influence that so-called First Nations people should have over political decision-making and so on. And it's far more radical than the Green Party would probably ever agree to. So, good on her for acting on the basis of her conviction. But whether or not what she did was the right thing to do, I think, is a moot point. And as a couple of conservative commentators have already commented, what if it was somebody who was in fact protesting against the whole Mardi Gras and world pride and so on? I'm fairly certain they would have been arrested.
Yes.
Now, why wasn't the same standard applied to her because of what she did to disrupt the parade? My understanding is she was just given a warning and asked to desist, which I think obviously she did. But, if it had been a prominent person from the conservative side of political thinking in Australia, or a prominent religious leader from one of the main religions in Australia, not necessarily Christian, but if it had been one of them, I think they might have been looking for a good lawyer. So, I mean, it exposes the incredible double standards that apply. But look, I do believe that even though I disagree very strongly with nearly everything that she stands for, she must have the right to expression in the public square. But so must we, and I think that's a really important point to make.
But do you feel like we need to go to that extent, or like that, because that's the thing, like we're seeing all this stuff and we're seeing people clashing and we're seeing protests and everything like that. I understand that protests have their place, like, but we as leaders, what can we do before it gets to that, before inciting violence or going and disrupting a someone else's event? What do you suggest we do?
I think we should rely mostly on the power of words. Within the Christian framework, of course, we talk about apologetics, and that the Greek word apologia, of course, means to have an argument. And I think ultimately words win. Words win. If you look through the overarching play of history over the last few thousand years, I think it's actually words, good, solid arguments that win the day. There is a Christian apologist by the name of Greg Kokel, who's based in the United States, and one of his major arguments in favour of Christianity is that it is the best explanation of reality. And of course, he goes into great detail about what that means, but I think he's right, and I think it's words that will ultimately win. And so leaders who feel really strongly, and look, I also think it's very important for those of us who are Christians that we check in with God. And because if I saw a Christian do that, my initial reaction would not be to condemn them or to say they're an extremist and they've gone too far. But I would simply want to know, is this what you believe God has called you to do?
Yeah.
And many people, certainly in Australia, will recall the Israel Folau case, which I think we have spoken about once or twice and a couple of times in passing. You know, many people said, well, what he did, it was a bit silly. He made these statements on social media. But for me, my issue was, well, did God tell you to do that? And he has actually addressed that issue and says, yes, I believe God told me to do that. And I think that is the most important thing.
100%. Yeah.
So my reaction isn't initially to condemn or to support, but I always would like to know, well, you know what, is this something, because God may well call some people to do things that others might see as being a bit outrageous. And there are biblical precedents, of course.
That's good. That's good. I actually feel like I could speak about this forever because there's a couple other things that I want to talk about with this. I'm just concentrating on time, but let's talk about it, because I remember like the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras happened like a couple of streets away from where I used to live in Sydney, and I remember around that time of year, it was just, the place was plastered with rainbows and everything like that, which actually I think it's kind of funny because whenever I see one of those rainbow flags, I just think about the rainbow over the ark and the promise that God gave us, you know, like it's funny that they seem to have claimed it, but I just remind myself that, you know what, that's our promise from God, that no matter how wicked the world gets, he still loves everyone and he's never going to do something like that again. So, yeah, maybe there's a bit of a side point there, but there's so many businesses that just get wrapped up in it, and Coles had their own float, and Google had their own float, and there's a bunch of big corporations that they had their own floats there and everything like that, which kind of lends itself to being, is it just a big corporate thing? It's all government funded, and there's a whole nother, I don't even want to get into that, but we spoke about ministry leaders, but what about business leaders? How do we, if we are Christians leading an organization, or even if we're not Christians, if we have certain values that don't agree with that, how do we stand up to the pressure from our own staff, from our clients, from our suppliers, from whatever, to get involved and show our support for this? And if we don't show our support, that means we're against it, and we're haters, and we're right-winged, racists, and whatever. Like, what should we do as business leaders to stand firm in our values against representing these sorts of things or being caught up?
Again, Craig, look, I think this is a really, really difficult area, and in Australia and in other countries. In the West, I'm primarily talking about the West, there are Christians in high positions within the business world who have actually lost their jobs because of their Christian faith.
Yeah.
And there have been some quite high-profile cases. For me, it's a really difficult issue because I don't want to say that big business and corporations shouldn't get involved in social issues. For example, a few years ago, there was involvement of some prominent business people in the whole area of dealing with modern slavery. And in the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, Australia, and many other countries, that eventually led to legislation that required large businesses to do supply chain audits and sort of cut out any areas in which there was modern slavery, because there's modern slavery everywhere, including in Australia.
Yeah.
Now, I saw that was a good thing. I don't agree with what's happening in a lot of large businesses now, where they are so openly supporting what I disagree with. I'm a little bit reluctant to say they shouldn't, Because if I say, well, they shouldn't get involved in social issues, then that also means they shouldn't get involved in social issues that I would actually support. So that sort of addresses, I think, half of your question. It's a terribly difficult thing.
I actually think that you do answer it in a roundabout way that actually gives a good point of like, have something that you maybe this is the call to action is make sure you as an organization have something that you are supporting and that you are standing for, that when these other needs or other like cultural things come up, you can go, yeah, that's fine. I'm called to stand up for this thing, right? And this is what we support, and this is what we as an organization, we get behind this wholly and solely. And maybe that's a bit of a nicer defense to something like that, is just as long as we know whether we are doing some social action, I suppose you could say, like you said, that gives us a little bit better of a leg to stand on, rather than goes that saying of like, make sure we're known for what we stand for, not what we stand against.
Yeah, look, even that worries me, because a lot of the world thinks, well, Christians are just against homosexuality and abortion and euthanasia. Well, one of the reasons for that's all that the press reports. They don't report on all the good things that communities of faith, including Christian communities, actually do. It's not newsworthy. You don't get thrown in jail for doing the good things, You get hauled before a Human Rights Commission because you dare to open your mouth and say something that might be taken as offence by another person. So it's very difficult. But I think, the other half of your question was about what do we do as individuals? And I know I sound like a cracked record, but look, you've got to know what God wants you to do.
Yeah.
And look, I respect leaders in business in high positions who are not coming out and making public statements against what you might loosely call, what the woke agenda. By the same token, I have a lot of admiration for those who do, often ultimately at the cost of their job. I really do think the key is you've got to know that you're hearing from God. Those of us who hold to classical or historical Christianity, we've got a pretty strong view on what is right and wrong in terms of how we express our sexuality and our sexual desires. And it seems that, frankly, most of the world couldn't care less. And then there's a small proportion, 2 or 3%, who care very, very deeply about it. And I think at the end of the day, it's really important for us. We got to know what the Bible has to say, because in my view, the Bible is the final arbiter on all matters concerning Christian faith and practice. But when we're actually in the middle of a situation as a leader, as a senior manager in a business, we've got to know, is God saying to us, now is the time for you to stand up? God might not be telling you to stand up now because he's saving you up for a more important occasion. In other words, God will use us strategically to fight battles. And we've just really we have to understand that as leaders, as managers in businesses and so on, we're partnering with God. When we're not actually doing the leading, he's doing the leading.
That's great. Yeah, look, let's just stand strong. Make sure we know what we stand for. Make sure you know what God is calling you to. Because you're absolutely right, Dr. Rod, that we aren't called, not all of us are called to speak out against every situation. And like you say, maybe God is creating us as a sleeper agent that is going to activate, sometime in the future, at a prime future, when you have maybe even more influence and it's a bigger impact that God has actually called you for. So make sure you stay close to knowing what God's called you to, and when he's calling you to it as well. I think that's really wise words. once again. And also a bit of a shameless plug about our free leadership program, where we start out the first 10 weeks by figuring out what is your calling, what are you called for, what is your purpose, what is your mandate from heaven. Let's transition. Let's move on from the city Mardi Gras, from one extreme to another, I suppose, talking about something that's really, really consuming the airways, so to speak, where almost every second article, every second thing that we're talking about right now is AI. ChatGPT. Dr. Rod, have you had a play around with ChatGPT yet?
No, I've been too busy in meetings and so on, but it's something that I do have to come to terms with, because apart from being a pastor, I'm a part-time university lecturer.
Mm-hmm.
And ChatGPT is featured in a lot of discussions in recent times because of its potential to write essays for people.
Mm-hmm.
And it does a reasonably good job, although I think there would be ways of writing essay questions that would make the ChatGPT response difficult. If you ask certain questions or set certain tasks that have a very strong conservative bent, ChatGTP will quite probably decline to provide your answer because there's a human mind or human minds that sit behind it. Anyway,
mm-hmm.
That's far too long an answer to your very short question.
No, I was very much the same. I was reading a lot about it. Whenever I went to jump on to give it a go, it always said, server's full, try back later. And I eventually got onto it, had a bit of a play around with it. I must admit, I didn't get as amazing, but and I know that there is a bit of a way that you do actually need. There's actually a bit of engineering with how you actually communicate with it. So that's actually quite interesting. But what I actually want to talk about with ChatGPT today is more looking from a business perspective, as a business leader, and in ministry as well as leaders in general. We're talking about controlling the controllables. There is something that's coming now, and it's called AI. And we can't control it, right? And I don't mean it's like Skynet and it's gonna, like the Terminator, and we can't control the robots. What I'm saying is we can't control what's happening, because we're in this new wave. Like this, people were talking about metaverse, a couple of months ago, that's going to be Web 3.0. No, I actually think that this whole ChatGPT AI thing, that is what Web 3.0 is. That's the next generation of things that we're facing. And as leaders in business, I mean, I'm already talking with my clients about it. I'm already talking with my team, my digital marketing team. We're already talking about how we shift, because it's completely changing the game with how everything's done. And so we as leaders in business and in ministries and everything like that need to be well aware, and especially like someone like yourself, Dr. Rod, as at universities, you have to be careful of how these things are actually going to impact how our businesses right now, and also into the future, into the very near future. But one person that I think did an amazing job of responding to this was Microsoft's CEO. Now I'm going to read his name so I can say it correctly. Satya Nadella. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But I saw this amazing interview of him on The Verve. All the links to our articles that we're talking about are down in the descriptions, and usually a few YouTube video links as well. So check out the description. There's always stuff down there. But there's this amazing article. I actually saw the interview that The Verge did on YouTube, and then they've also got an article here. I encourage you, go and watch it. Go and watch it. If you're a leader, I want you to watch it from two aspects. I want you to first of all go and watch CEO Satya. Yash, am I saying that correctly? I think he is of Indian descent. Satya, am I saying that correctly? Yes. Give me a thumbs up. Am I saying it correctly? Satya. Thank you. Satya. Perfect. Satya. So have a look at him and see how he was actually responding to the questions, how he carried himself. I think from first of all, from a leadership perspective, he carried himself with great humility, right? It was amazing with the humility that he was carrying himself with, and the confidence that he had and how he was responding and everything like that as well. So I actually find that I want to encourage you, watch that video back and see how you can, sorry, Yash, do you mind muting yourself? I can hear myself through. Perfect. Thanks. The joys of live, doing things live. The way he carries himself, the way he responds, how generous he is in talking about the competition, because normally it's all about crushing the competition or not even acknowledging him. But he really praises the competition, which is Google, and just kind of talks competitively, but from a place of humility. So first of all, I want you to watch it from that perspective and see how you can carry yourself in that, how you would carry yourself in a similar situation. The second way I would suggest you looking at it is just looking at from how he's responding from a technology change standpoint, how he's responding to the evolution of this technology that is changing right before our eyes. What we're in is like the iPhone being released. That's what we're kind of talking about. And even before that, calculators, going on what Dr. Rob was saying, he has to now, it can write essays for you. It's kind of like when the calculator was made available to students, that they could just calculate the maths equation. Now, how do we respond? So we as business people, as leaders in business, in ministry, and in all areas of life, we need to be able to respond to those technology changes, which I encourage you, go and watch the video and watch him from a standpoint of how he carries himself as a leader, but also how he responded to technology changes. You're talking about how ChatGPT is now linking up with Bing and what they're doing now with literally an open playing field in front of them. They're not having to, adapt. They're not having to try to compete. There is literally this new thing, and it's a blank slate for everyone, and no one has the advantage at the moment. Dr. Rod, what's your take on his, how he carries himself and even just the things that he was talking about, of how we actually should respond as leaders to these immense changes that we're about to face?
Well, I have to confess that I didn't see the whole of that interview. I have seen part of it. Look, I think he bore himself very well indeed, and actually did show some very good leadership qualities. And I think as a Christian, I don't like a kind of Darwinian model of competition in the market.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's perfectly fine. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you see, then the fittest can be defined in various ways, and
yes.
If you haven't got a particular moral framework, what constitutes the fittest organisation can look, pretty different to what you might expect it to.
Yep.
But I do think that for the flourishing of humankind, for the advancement of humankind, good products should thrive. They should thrive in the marketplace. And look, like so many technologies, of course, AI can be used for good or it can be used for ill. It really depends on the person who's driving it. And we've been living with AI for a long time now. You mentioned the iPhone, which was an absolute revolution because it really heralded the age of smartphones, and our smartphone is an AI device.
Yep.
So if you think, I don't want to interact with AI, if you've got a smartphone, and most people do these days, you're interacting with AI all the time.
Actually, even what Satya said is he said even just back in the days of, the red squiggly line in Word, like when you that's AI,
Exactly.
Like we're already dealing with it. So
we deal with it all the time, but it didn't really have that label. And it can be used for good and evil. If I can just digress very briefly, John Lennox, who's is an academic, I think he was at Oxford University, I believe he's retired now, he's a mathematician by training, but he's done a lot of research on AI, and he wrote a book on it, and I understand he's just published a revised edition. And I heard him interviewed by John Anderson, who does a really good podcast. And John Lennox was saying that artificial intelligence has taken us to the point where it is actually feasible for human beings to live forever.
Wow.
Dying will be a choice. The big issue is whose choice. That's the big issue. Whose choice? And I can't be confident that it will be my choice, right? So that's where AI has taken us. AI has got us to the point where we could, in fact, deal with death in a different way to how Jesus did it and dealt with it. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. But, when we use a search engine of any kind, that we're using AI anyhow. So what's happening here is that the facility is being greatly enhanced by the use of OpenAI, which is the base upon which ChatGTP GPT is built, and that's now being grafted into Bing, and I think Microsoft Edge as well, and Google have got a version of it either underdeveloped now, or it might even have been released.
That was quite funny, because Microsoft did their launch of Bing and ChatGPT amongst some of their other things, and they did this launch, and it was polished, it was amazing, and it has impressed me. Actually, I must admit, Microsoft have really changed the game lately. I mean, right now, Dr. Rod and I and Yash, we're all meeting on Microsoft Teams. I've now transferred everything. My whole business pretty much runs through Microsoft Teams. Our apps, our servers are all on Microsoft servers now. They've kind of really reset from those days of Windows 95, where they had real control, and then they kind of lost it and everything like that. They're coming back, and now they're becoming quite dominant. But it's actually quite funny when you mentioned before about the competition, right? Like that competition is healthy, and unfortunately Google hasn't had it in the search space. They haven't had the competition, and there was a quote that Satya said is like, yes, Google are the 300-pound gorilla, and we're making them dance, and we're just proud to say that we're the ones that made them dance. And going back to like the fact that they've launched, it was like the day after or whatever, they had their own event, but they weren't planning on launching their search AI thing at the time, and they were scrambling, and it's actually funny when you see the comparisons of them. Is Microsoft did this, and this kind of comes back to the leadership stuff of like making sure that we are following our trends and following trends in the marketplace, but not scrambling and not finding ourselves too far behind, because that's what Google did. And their thing didn't work on stage, and it was there was errors in literally what they were doing, and it was just, So I think it's funny that they launched they teased theirs as well, because Microsoft did, and their shares just plummeted because of how they presented it. Sorry to interrupt you, but
that's fine.
Very, very interesting.
I don't think we've got anything really further to add, but Yeah, AI is ubiquitous now. It's in most of our appliances, many of our appliances. If you have a look at the number of appliances attached to your internet service, you might get a shock. I looked last night, I think I had 16.
Wow.
So that includes electrical appliances these days, fridges and so on as well. We're surrounded by it.
Yeah, it's crazy. So we as leaders, I think just to bring it back to what we can learn as leaders from this is, number one, I encourage you need to research what's happening with AI, because you cannot be left behind. I'm talking with all of my clients about it. What can we do? Now, obviously, from a marketing standpoint, we can take advantage of these changes. If we can be ahead of the game, and this is kind of just a bit of free advice for you, marketing has always been about content. Back in radio, it was about radio content. Then obviously, newspapers was print content, and then you had television, and then marketing has always been about content. But the content changes towards the medium that is working in the season, right? A couple of years ago, it was social media. That was where the content was. I mean, this is what we're doing. We're creating content to promote, our knowledge and our experience, and hopefully get you to join our free leadership program. But content is the game. But now content has become even more valuable because of AI. Whereas previously you just had to have some articles or have some keywords on your page for it to come up in search. Now, because they're going to use AI, it's going to scrape the internet and present the best information in an even more succinct manner. It's so much more important that your content is so much better quality, so much of a higher standard, and using different mediums, and there's a whole bunch of different things, but you need to be looking into how your content now can feed into this next wave of search, which will be Bing and ChatGPT and Google's Butler, Barry, Brendan, whatever, I don't know. They gave it some random name. I think it was started with a B, Paul or something, I don't know. But it's happening, right? So we need to make sure that we run our businesses keeping up with those trends of marketing, but also the trends within our industry of how we interact with our clients, how we help people. I've been looking into it. We've been building our mobile app for the last 2 years, and we've got a couple of it's live on both Android and Apple. But there's a few more features we're ready to add. Once we've done that, my next thing is I've already been planning on how to build in AI to help answer questions for people. So I don't actually need to be able to give the answer to people, but they can almost like a chat bot, but that's AI, right? And so I'm looking at how I can stay on the edge with that. How can you stay on the edge with your clients, making sure that you're ahead of the curve rather than falling behind like Google seemed to have? And as a bit of a side note, watch the video, check out the video below and see how the Microsoft CEO handles himself. It is, if you just watch it from that point of view, you'll get great value. I think it's a 20-minute interview. So treat yourself. And if you don't have the time, put the playback speed at 1.5 or something like that, so you go through it quicker. But talking about things changing, and I mean, going back to, we're talking about our topic of control the controllables. Like AI is happening. We can't control that, but we can control how we respond in our businesses, in our ministries, and how we can respond to that. Now, controlling the controllables. Let's go to something that is uncontrollable, and that is a revival. Now, it brings me so much joy to be able to talk about this. When we talk about ministry leaders, we don't always have a positive story to share, unfortunately. But it warms my heart that we have yet another positive topic to talk about with our ministry leaders in talking about this revival that's happening in Asbury University. It's just amazing to see it. It's been happening for now a number of weeks now, I think it is now. I forget how many consecutive days it's been happening. But what I actually want to talk about is, and actually, Dr. Rod, you obviously being in university, you've been CEO of a higher learning institution as well, and vice presidents and all this sort of stuff. You're a professional academic. This revival is amazing. From your pastor, with wearing your pastor's hat, this is amazing. Now put on your higher education CEO hat. The president has had to now shut down this revival that's been happening for, I think, a couple of weeks or something like that, however long it's been happening for. He's had to make this decision to shut it down. It's been this 24-hour revival that's just this worship event that's been happening. And it's literally streets and streets. Like the whole town has been shut down because people have been traveling there. It's just packed. And he's had to make the decision for the betterment, I think that's the right word, for the students' education, that they have to stop the 24-hour services and limit the timing of it and everything like that, and looking at moving it off-site somewhere so that the university can go back to universitying, right, to educating its people, which is its purpose. Dr. Rod, how do you balance that? It's a Christian university. You're a leader. You're seeing this incredible move of God, but you have a responsibility to your students to make sure that they're still being educated and going through their courses. They don't fall behind. How do you wrestle with that idea in making that decision to stop a revival?
Wow, that's a real toughie. Of course, I've been following this with great interest. It started on the 8th of February, and I did see I haven't seen the full address by the president of Asbury University to the student body. But my understanding is the primary motivation wasn't so much internal matters to do with the university, but the fact that the town in which Asbury is situated is a small town, population of 6,000. And the town itself just could not cope with the very large numbers of people who were coming in from outside who wanted to be part of what was happening in the chapel. It was happening in the chapel at Asbury, which looks to me to have a capacity of just a few hundred, maybe 300, 350 people. It could be a little bit more than that. So I think the big dilemma was how do we behave as good citizens in our community? I have heard interviews with students, with academic staff, and look, the staff have been accommodating students by giving them extensions on assignments and giving them leave passes from class and offering makeup classes. So look, I think the whole thing has been managed very, very well. There's also been a strong desire on the part of the leaders, and the leaders have actually been students, and staff have been very supportive and sort of in the background. But they've taken great care that this doesn't become a big media event. And look, they haven't really been open to the leaders of the big, well-known ministries coming in and taking the microphone, so to speak, although many have visited and just sat and received as part of this revival.
Yeah, actually, I thought that was quite an interesting leadership decision. That I saw reports of there was a lot of famous worship leaders and mega church pastors and people from people that have big name and, let's say, celebrity status were offering their services to come and be a part of this. And they said, thanks, but no thanks, because we want this to be about God, not about the name, a celebrity name. So I think that's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, I've been privy to some private communications as well, which I wouldn't publicise them, but it gives me great confidence that this is genuine and that the leaders have done all they can to ensure that nothing really kind of takes the glory away from God, shall we say. They've been very, very careful, and I have great respect for them. When I first saw the president speaking to the church body, I guess my heart sank a little, but as he explained the reasons, I thought, no, look, they're trying to be good citizens within their local community. And I don't think they're shutting down the revival per se.
No.
What they're doing is they're sort of changing, if you like, the public face of the revival.
Yeah.
And the other point, which I think is well worth making, is that there are little fires of revival breaking out in many, many different parts of the United States and different parts of the world.
Yeah.
There has been an ongoing, I guess we would call it a revival, not too far from where I live, actually, on the Sunshine Coast here in Queensland. I was listening to an itinerant preacher just a few days ago. He said that he'd got recent reports of amazing things happening in the Netherlands and in other European countries. And look, the proportion of people who are regular churchgoers in the Netherlands and other European countries is very low. I mean, it's about 15%, way below what it is in Australia, and we're about half what it is in the United States. So marvellous things are happening all over the world. So I wouldn't see this really, it's not shutting down a revival. It certainly is changing the nature and the expression of that revival. But if you're looking for revival, what I would say to you as a pastor is look in your own backyard. and I can say this as a pastor in our own church. We're a small congregation. The last 2 Sundays have been very different. In fact, 2 Sundays ago, I abandoned altogether the idea of delivering a sermon. Our pre-service prayer went way over time, and I felt that was important because we were really experiencing the presence of God in a way that we hadn't experienced since the church was planted. Our worship time went way over time. And really, I just, when my own contribution at the end of the day was to share a little about what was happening in Asbury and some other Christian universities. This was a couple of weeks ago now. And then we took communion. And then this Sunday just passed. Our prayer time went a little bit over time, but again, we just really sensed a connection with the Lord that we hadn't really experienced up until the previous week. We had a long worship, and I'd more or less prepared for that. I did a short sermon. Again, we took communion, and I talked about these fires of revival that are breaking out, it seems, all over the world. Yeah. So there's something happening, Craig. And, I think for a small community, you know, their accommodation houses couldn't deal with the issue there. They couldn't manage the very long queues. There were simply too many people in the small town. But they've changed the public face of the revival. I don't think they've shut it down. But look, honestly, can I just encourage people, don't jump on a plane and go and see it happening somewhere else. Be open to the Lord bringing revival in your own backyard because it's happening.
Yeah, because I don't know about your God, but my God isn't restricted to a physical location. He kind of is this, he's omni, isn't he? I think he's not uni. He's omni, right?
Yes, he is. Yeah.
So yeah, like, and Jesus said, you have not because you ask not, right? Like, ask for the revival to happen. I think that's the point from this that I kind of take from this is, yes, you're right. He's not shutting it down. I said that as a bit of a.
That's what the media is saying.
Yeah,
the media is saying that, Craig. But with respect, I think they're wrong.
Yeah,
I just don't think they've read the situation correctly.
And I just
but God isn't shutting revival down.
No. I think that's our opportunity, right? It's like, no, it's not shutting down. It's now's our opportunity for it to spread, for it to disperse, all those people to now take it back to their hometowns, for you and I to pray that we get a sense of that from wherever, because God's moving and he's not limited to a location, but he is limited by our open or closed hearts. So that's what limits revival. It's whether our hearts is your heart open for a revival in your business? There may be things you're believing for in your business. I'm not saying you break out into a worship session in your business. I mean, maybe if you have that sort of a relationship, great, go for it. But if you don't, maybe just turn your office, your personal office, into an anointed space and ask for revival there, and start seeing people saved in your business, people stress. You're just praying for people's stress to be minimized, because let's be honest, like, coming out of COVID, like, we're now starting to see, yes, there was a lot of bad things happen, but we're actually starting to see the stats, and we'll probably talk about this in coming weeks. It was one of the topics I was possibly going to talk about, but there's a lot of things happening. We know that people are struggling nowadays. People that don't have Christ as their foundation, they are struggling. They're stressed. They're worried. They got pressures. Pray for their release from that control. Pray for their release from that stress and anxiety, and just start seeing a revival happen. Maybe it's new. And I declare this over your business. And maybe you've been looking for some new staff, and maybe the revival is going to be some new good staff members in your business. Maybe the revival is going to be some new clients that are going to come in and revive, your bottom line, but also they're going to be a great joy to work with, and really harness your gifts and your purpose. Maybe revival can happen in so many ways. Just believe that there is going to be a revival around you, as long as you keep your heart open. That's probably a good place to leave that, unless you have something else to share on that, Dr. Rod.
Oh, look, I could share for a long time, but I think it might put too many people to sleep. But no, let's move on.
I agree.
Yeah.
There could be so much, but it's just amazing to see it. Move of God is happening now. But we always pray for a revival to come. Stop praying for a revival. It's here. It is happening, and you can have it where you are too. So, biblical leaders. We always finish off with referring back to the Bible, and we're going through this season of looking at leadership lessons from Luke. And as we were talking about this controlling the controllables and all our topics we had today, of all these changes and everything happening in our worlds, Dr. Rod actually suggested that we share from Luke 1 verses 1 to 4. I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Rod, if you want to take this out and see how we can learn to be better leaders from Luke.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Craig. Craig asked me if I had any ideas for our little segment on leadership lessons from Luke, and I thought, well, why don't I go to the very first verse and see what he has to say for himself? And this is what he says. Now, just by way of background, Luke, of course, was not one of the original disciples. Our understanding from the writings of Paul and others is that he was a Gentile. He was certainly a companion of Paul's, and most authorities would agree that Luke wrote both the Gospel that goes by his name and also the book of Acts. And so there is a kind of theme running through both the book of Luke and through Acts as well. But this is what Luke says right at the beginning of his Gospel. And I'm reading from my large print Bible, which I can actually see. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, that's really a reference to all the prophecies about the Messiah coming to pass. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. So he's saying, well, okay, there were eyewitnesses. And now he says this: it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. So Theophilus was the intended audience of the original writing. Then he says that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So the key words here is that Luke took it upon himself to write an orderly account. And this speaks to me of research. So number one, Luke wasn't one of the original eyewitnesses of the ministry of Jesus, but he clearly came to know about it as a Gentile because of the stories that eyewitnesses had presented to him, or those who were once or twice removed from the original eyewitnesses. There was probably not a lot documented at the time that he wrote, although there would certainly have been something of the Gospels circulating around the churches at the time. So he undoubtedly interviewed people. So he did his research, that's pretty clear, but he also assembled everything to create what he called an orderly account. And I think there's an important lesson there for us as leaders. We're responsible as leaders to do our research. In other words, to know what's what, to know the facts, to gain knowledge, and obviously to process it through our Christian biblical worldview, and to seek God's wisdom as well. And I really love the idea of making it or putting it into an orderly account. Why an orderly account? So people can understand it.
Yeah,
an orderly account implies good communication, and leadership is probably 80% good communication. So I think this lesson is something we can take from the book of Luke, and we only have to read the first four verses to get that lesson.
I love that, Dr. Rod. And kind of to tie that into everything else that we've been talking today is, like, obviously we talk about Andrew Tate being caught up in jail in a foreign country and doesn't know. Well, it's important that he and his legal team and everything like that do the research and then present their findings in an orderly account, right? You know, when we're talking about the city Mardi Gras, when Dr. Rod said we need to be able to stand up for what we believe in, we can't do that effectively if we haven't done our research. We can't actually, I do a lot of communication training, especially with leadership. It's very, very true. But one of my past partnerships was specializing in training professional speakers. And one of the things I used to say to people is, if you can't write it down, you can't speak it out. So often we kind of go, oh yeah, I know what I'm going to talk about, and then just go to talk about that thing without having written it down first. Before all of these things, I research, I read through all the articles, and then I make myself some dot points. I write it down of my thoughts so that we can, obviously there's a lot of stuff that's off the cuff because as Dr. Rod and I discuss, we come up with different ideas, and that's a great thing about this format is it's just pretty much a conversation. But if we to have a voice in the town square, we must have an orderly account because we want to have that influence over people. Don't have apathy. I think that's probably the right word for it. Don't just bury your head in the sand and just think that this whole thing is going to go away and someone else will deal with it. No. You need to stand up for what God has called you to stand up for. And that happens, as Luke says, by taking an orderly account, doing that research. We talk about ChatGTP and Bing, that's the changes in AI that is happening. You have to do the research and you have to be able to present to your team what that means. I'm discussing almost on a weekly basis, I'm talking with my team of like, okay, now I've got some new information. Now this is what it looks like. And we're kind of working it out as we go along so that we can present it in a way that it makes sense. obviously we're talking about this Asbury University president changing the way that the public facing of this revival, the way he presented it, you could tell he presented it with an orderly account. He did his research. He got his advice. He took all things into consideration and then presented it forward. And as Dr. Rod said, when at first he was disappointed, and then after he heard it, he's like, okay, you know what? That actually makes sense. And so see how much of a difference that can make, where you could be presenting something that is quite controversial, like canceling a revival, and not presented in an orderly account, and it just comes across wrong and has a different impact. Whereas as Dr. Rod was impacted, he's like, actually, no, I get this. Like, I get this. I understand this, and now we can move forward with it. So I think when you recommended that, Dr. Rod, I just thought it stood out perfectly for what we're talking about today, because we as leaders need to take the time, and Luke did, and that was the that's the whole thing about Luke is actually the longest gospel. And if you look at Luke and Acts, it is actually the longest representation of that whole journey. And it's because he took his time to research and write it down, and invested a lot of money, because he was a physician, he was a doctor. So he had money behind him, and he was able to invest in that, because it's important for us to invest in what we're called to. Invest in our own learning, invest in our education, so that we can present things in an orderly account, as Luke writes. Dr. Rod, do you have any last thoughts about that at all?
No, look, except to reiterate the comment that you made about the importance of preparation. As leaders, we owe it to the people we influence and the people we are empowering to be well prepared. So if we're leading a meeting, it is important that we've done our research, we've done our reading. For example, I chair the board of a charity here on the Gold Coast. We had a board meeting this morning. The board meeting couldn't have run well if I hadn't been well prepared, if I didn't know what was in all the papers, if I hadn't read through all of the financial documentation, had a look at all the papers we were going to discuss, and so on. So if you're in that kind of formal role, it really is important that you do your preparation beforehand. I used to teach Bible college students, I still do, but some years ago I used to teach public speaking. And one of the little quips I used to often say, listen, there's only one thing better than anointed presentation, and that's anointed presentation backed up by anointed preparation. That's so good. There you go. You can have that one for free.
I love that. Anointed presentation is only better with anointed preparation. That is great. Dr. Rod, thank you. Thank you so much. We've gone a little bit longer today than we normally do. Hey, if you've stuck through to the end, thank you. We appreciate you watching right through to the end of this. If you've enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. If any of these topics that we've spoken about have sparked any of your interest or challenged your leadership, or you've had experiences similar, chuck your chats below. We'd love to see those chats. And hey, please consider subscribing to our channel for more of our faith-based leadership development content. And we will be seeing you every week live at this time, wherever you are around the world, this time, every day, not every day, every week. Every day is a little bit too much, but we'll be live every week at this time. And so we encourage you, set a reminder and join us. And we appreciate you joining us. Afterwards, Yash is going to check up some other videos for you to go back and watch previous episodes, and other videos that we have from us. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We appreciate you, Dr. Rod. Thank you so much for taking your time and giving your advice, as always. Yash, thank you for pressing all the buttons in the background, and thank you for watching. We look forward to seeing you again next week to help you better learn to become a better leader who lives on purpose.